Okay, so before I tell you anything about the next homework assignment you're going to be doing, does anybody have any questions about the summary assignment you're doing that's due tonight? Everybody's more or less clear on what you have to do, right? You're writing two separate 250-word summaries, right? One is a summary of the whole thing, and the second is a focused summary of some specific point in the thing, right? Okay, everybody gets it? Everybody's going to do it? Great. So, your fourth homework assignment is going to require you to find or write yourself 5 enthymemes. Does anybody have any idea what an enthymeme is? I will take your generalized silence to mean no. Okay. So this is something that's spelled out in the next chapter in the textbook, but just, best we explain this now. Do any of you know what a syllogism is? Has anybody ever heard of a syllogism? Okay, Heather, you're nodding. What is a syllogism?
I think I've heard it. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I remember we covered it in the past.
Okay. So I'm going to put one on the board and you tell me if this looks familiar. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Anybody seen anything like this before? Does this look a little bit familiar? Okay, so essentially what a syllogism is, right? It's a means for testing the logic of a particular proposition by applying a specific case to a general principle, right? So the first line of a syllogism is always going to be that general principle, right? We call that the major premise. Right? So all members of this category are also members of this category, right? Socrates is human. So what we have here, we call this the minor premise. Right? This is the application of a specific case to test your general principle. And the final line is our conclusion. Right? Yes, this checks out, this makes sense. If all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human, then Socrates is mortal. So we can divide the terms in this up into an A term, a B term, and a C term, right? Where A is the smaller category in the major premise. B is the bigger category that you're comparing it to, right? And C is the specific case that you're trying to apply. So we can see how this works out in practice, right? A has to repeat itself as the second term in the minor premise. And C and B have to repeat themselves as the first and second terms in the conclusion, right? That's how you can tell you have a valid syllogism. That's how you can tell it's logically valid. So, if I was to give you something like, all fish can swim, Brian can swim, therefore, Brian is a fish. Is that a valid syllogism? Does that check out logically? Does that follow the rules? Take a minute, look it over, think about it. Valid or not?
Does it have to be like realistic to be valid, or?
We'll get to that in a minute. Pardon?
It's not,
Why would you say it's not valid, Jackson?
because there is no, well, the fish is not in the second line, that's the egg.
Yeah, the terms are in the wrong places, right? Our A term and B term are reversed here. So you can tell right away that this is not a valid logical syllogism, right? Now, as to respond to Marissa's question, what do you guys think? Like, does a syllogism have to be true in order to be valid? Is a syllogism like this able to test for the truth of a proposition? If I were to write, say, all artists are from Pluto, Ezra is an artist, therefore, Ezra is from Pluto. Is this a valid syllogism? Yes, because it works logically, right? But Ezra is not from Pluto, he is from Thomasville, right? Which is, last time I checked, not in fact on another planet. So a syllogism can be logically valid without actually being true, right? It doesn't test for truth, it only tests for logic. Right? So an enthymeme is basically a syllogism that leaves one of the premises unstated, right? You have to infer what the unstated premise is. So to give you an example of what one looks like, right? We see these all the time in daily life. We see them in advertising, we see them in song lyrics, we see them in movies, we see them on TV, we use them in conversation, we just don't realize it, right? We don't know what it is we're doing. So, to give you a fairly simple one to start with here, right? This is from an old ad for a fast food joint. A bigger burger is a better burger. The burgers are bigger at Burger King. What's implied here but left unstated? Yes, essentially we've got a syllogism here without the conclusion, right? If a bigger burger is a better burger, and the burgers are bigger at Burger King, then the burgers are better at Burger King, right? Everybody get it? Now some of these won't quite take the form of an obvious syllogism like this does. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit more subtle. Many of you have probably seen this ad. It's been floating around from time immemorial, right? It's for a brand of jams and jellies, right? With a name like Smucker's, it has to be good. So what's the unstated idea behind this? With a name like Smucker's, it has to be good. What's implied or assumed here? Smucker's jelly is good. Okay, or at least that the brand would not want to sully its good name by putting out an inferior jam, right?
Right.
There's another possible answer to this too. There could be a kind of joke implied here that Smucker's isn't a very appetizing name. So if they're willing to put that name on their products and still expect them to sell, then the jelly must be damn good, right? Okay, so here's one from Shakespeare play. It's from Julius Caesar. So when Shakespeare's ally, not Shakespeare's ally, Julius Caesar's ally, Mark Antony, is giving a funeral speech for his dead friend. And he says, I come to bury Caesar not to praise him. What's implied in this? Why would somebody like Antony feel the need to say this as he gives this funeral oration to this audience? What would the audience be expecting him to do?
Praise Caesar.
Right, exactly, and that's the implication here, right? He says this to tell the audience, right, I'm not here to do what you were expecting me to do. Give you a couple more, just to make sure we've reinforced this. Okay, how many of you saw the first of the Star Wars prequel movies? Okay, that's about a quarter of you, so some of you will recognize this line. This is spoken by the Jedi Master Yoda to young Anakin Skywalker. And fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hatred. Hatred leads to suffering. That is the path to the dark side. I sense much fear in you. What's the implication here?
That Anakin goes to the dark side.
Yeah, that Anakin Skywalker is on his way to the dark side already as a cute little blonde child, right? So that's the unstated premise, right? He says, I sense much fear in you. What he means is, you're already on the path to the dark side, right? All right, one more. This is from an old Public Enemy song. Elvis was a hero to most. Elvis was a hero to most. Elvis was a hero to most. But he never meant shit to me. Straight out racist, simple and plain. Motherfuck him and John Wayne. What's implied in this lyric?
John Wayne is also racist.
Okay, yeah, he's associating Elvis and John Wayne with each other, right? And saying that they're racist, right? But who is he suggesting that they're heroes to, and who are they not heroes to?
Heroes to white people.
Yeah, he's suggesting that Elvis and John Wayne are heroes to white people, but not to black people, right? That's the implication here, right? And I give you these to show you once again that enthymemes are all over the place, right? They're all over popular culture, they're all over advertising culture, they're all over literature, right? They are in our day-to-day speech. So it shouldn't be too hard for you to find 5 and write them down, right? And once you've found them, I want you to explain what's implied in each of them. And I am also aware that there are websites that will list like 7 or 8 examples of enthymemes for you, right? I know what those websites are. I know what examples they use. Please do not go there and simply copy down their enthymemes and explanations, right? People have done this in the past, right? So I want you to try to come up with these by yourself. Just, you know, when you're watching TV, when you're reading, when you're doing anything else, right? Just look for statements that seem to fit this kind of pattern, write them down, explain them, turn them in. Okay? Any questions about this?
So do you just
Yeah.
want us to find like examples like you just said, or completely make up our own?
If you don't feel like you can find examples, you can try to make up your own.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah. As long as they are original to you and not copied from some outside source that has already broken them down for you.
We need to write down where we found it from.
Yeah, that's actually, yeah, you should probably do that, yes. Yes, tell me what you got it from. At least tell me like what the ad was or what the song was or the movie or whatever, right? So, right, so this we can source to, you know, Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Right, this we can source to Fight the Power by Public Enemy, right? That's the kind of sourcing I would need here. That's the kind of sourcing I would want you to do. Okay, any other questions about this? All right, good. So, to start us off with what today's main topic is, right? This is just to give you enough material to do the homework. And you'll be happy to hear as well, right, that this is going to be the last homework assignment for a few days, right? These have come at you pretty fast. You guys have done a really, really good job of keeping up with them so far. And you'll have a couple days off from doing any of this sort of thing after this is due on Tuesday, right? But then, you know, about, you know, a week from then we're going to start longer, more, slightly more complex writing projects. So, first thing I want you to think about today so I'm going to flash a quote up here on the screen. I want you to read it, and I want you to tell me what it's a conversation between two characters, right? And I want you to tell me what problem in the first character's language the second is pointing out, okay? So just focus for now on the first set of quote up here. Don't worry about what's under the asterisk yet. So what problem in language is Gandalf referring to in this little conversation?
The different implications that he could have meant by that.
Yeah, that, you know, we see Bilbo Baggins says good morning and he meant it, right? But whoever he's talking to has no way of knowing necessarily what he means by it, right? So yeah, what Gandalf is spelling out here is the different possible meanings this statement could carry, right? Because it's not clear from context which one is meant. And I swear, I'm genuinely not like obsessed with The Hobbit or anything like that. I'm working on an article on this right now, so this is just kind of on my brain. which is why I keep using this kind of thing as an example. So then if we look down at the second example here, right? Bilbo Baggins has turned away from Gandalf, started conspicuously reading his mail, and has said good morning again. So what's being pointed out here in the second example?
The context of good morning has changed in this movie.
Yeah, the context has changed, right? In that Bilbo has actually now provided a context for understanding his meaning, right? Essentially, what he means by good morning this time is buzz off, which he's shown by his body language. Right? We're done talking, go away. So, the basic point that I'm trying to make with this, right, is that if you want your reader, your listener, whoever, to understand what it is you're talking about, the most important thing for you to do, first and foremost, define your terms, right? As we've discussed before, most language is context dependent. And so it is often going to be necessary for you to explain the context you're using a particular word in and what precisely you mean by it, because the definition of that thing may not be quite as clear as you think it is to other people. So I'll give you a quick example here. How many of you are taking or have taken music appreciation? Okay, that's a good number of you, right? And you do have to write a few papers in that class, right? Maybe it depends on who you take it with. I do know of people who have had to write papers in music appreciation. Well, let's just imagine for a moment, right? Just do a thought experiment with me here, that you have to write a paper in music appreciation. So what you are going to be doing is comparing certain tendencies in two broad genres, right? You're going to be talking about rock and pop. So what's the first thing you need to do then, before you start talking about the differences between these two things?
Define. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, you have to make it clear to your reader what they are, right? Which is not necessarily an easy thing to do, because we're talking about very broad categories here, right? So where would be a good place to start doing this? How might you start doing this?
Maybe tell like what time period of pop or what time period of rock you're talking
Yeah,
about.
like the
Okay.
history of the two genres.
Okay, you could talk a little bit about the histories of the two genres, right? And what is that necessarily then going to bring up if you're talking about the history of each genre?
Influences,
Influences, right?
styles.
Styles.
Artists.
Artists, yeah. One of the best places to start, right, would be, again, to get concrete, right, to get as specific as possible, and think of examples of artists working in each style, and think about what they have in common. So, before we start doing this, I noticed last time a distinct reticence on the part of my Monday-Wednesday class to admit that they knew the names of any pop artists, right? For some reason, people seem to think that to know that was uncool and embarrassing, right? It's not. I'm not going to make fun of you. Nobody else is going to make fun of you, right? So just feel free to go. We might actually talk in a minute about why that is, that people feel more embarrassed about listing off the names of pop artists than the names of rock artists. Yeah, just give me some examples of pop artists that you're familiar with.
Ariana Grande.
Pardon? Okay, Ariana Grande, yeah. Okay, good.
Michael Jackson.
Michael Jackson, MJ. Good. Madonna, okay, good. Keep going. Give me a couple more. Britney Spears.
Would you consider the Seagulls to be pop or rock?
The
Seagulls?
seagulls, like as in the birds, the
No, the
seabirds.
band.
I am not familiar with.
Oh,
this
it's for
particular
mine.
band. Well, no, just spell it for me.
What do you mean? It's spelled the Seagulls.
But is it spelled like the seabird? Or?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
Okay,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay, sure. All right.
From like the 70s.
The 80s, but yeah.
Oh, were you thinking of a flock of seagulls?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay, right. Okay, okay. Now I know who you're talking about.
Gotcha.
Duran Duran.
Okay, Duran. And maybe give me one more.
Bruno Mars.
Who?
Bruno Mars.
Bruno Mars. Okay, good. All right. Now, give me the names of a few rock artists. Okay, Queen.
Metallica.
Good. Metallica.
Led Zeppelin.
Led Zeppelin.
Def Leppard.
Def Leppard.
Pink Floyd.
Oh, Pink Floyd. Okay. When I was growing up, we always called Def Leppard your mom's favorite metal band.
Nice.
They were just five nice English boys who looked like they needed a sandwich. I don't know. All right, Kiss. Right, has to be all capital letters. Nirvana. Okay, I think that's a pretty good list here, right? Now, are there any individuals in either list that we think might actually fit better in the other? That might have more in common with artists on the other list?
I would say Flock of Seagulls probably fits more with rock.
Okay, yeah, let's move a flock of seagulls over into the other column. Any others that you feel like might fit better in the other column?
I was gonna say like Duran, but they're one of those.
Yeah, I mean,
in
it's
between. It's very.
Yeah.
It's that time period.
yeah,
Yeah.
but in some ways they do have more in common with groups over here, right?
In some ways.
Yeah. So let's, for now, stick them over here.
Could Queen go into pop music?
Okay, why would you put Queen into, like, would you say that Queen has more in common with Ariana Grande or with Led Zeppelin?
I feel like that really does depend on some of their songs.
Okay, yeah, so some songs could go either way, right? But if we look at the similarities between the items in this list and the items in this list, what's the first big thing we notice?
They're individuals.
Yeah, pop artists tend to be solo acts, right? Rather than groups. Even rock solo artists tend to work with a consistent group over time. You know, the Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, Neil Young and Crazy Horse, right? So yeah, so pop seems to favor the solo artist. Rock tends to be more of a group-based genre. And even when you have a pop group, like say something like Fifth Harmony, or as I like to call them, Simon Cowell Refused to Let Five Pretty Girls Go Home at Once, or One Direction, right? The focus is on the individual member's vocal prowess, right? So does that actually point to another difference between pop and rock artists? What's the primary focus of a pop song usually? Sonically, musically.
Vocals.
The singer, the vocals, right? Right, the singer is almost always way up front in the mix, and often is kind of showing off how good their pipes are, right? Not that rock singers don't do that, but there's definitely much more emphasis on instrumental prowess typically in rock than there is in pop, right? And if we think about what kinds of instruments are typically used in both genres, what seem to be the main instruments in a pop song?
Keyboards.
Yeah, keyboards and synthesizers, right, are the big thing.
Electronics.
Yeah. Keyboards, synths, electronics of various sorts, right? What about in a rock group?
Guitar, drum, bass.
Yep, guitar, bass, drums, right? Sometimes keyboards, but if there is a keyboard in the band, is it usually the main instrument that you hear? Now it's usually like kind of a background textural element, right? What about in terms of songwriting? How many pop stars write their own songs?
Few.
Some do. You know, Michael Jackson certainly did.
Yeah.
I think Bruno Mars writes a lot of his own material. But a lot of pop stars have their stuff written for them, right? Outside songwriters are brought in. Whereas in a rock group, the composition is often done by the band or by a member of the band, right? And if you see a rock band that is hiring a lot of outside songwriters, it usually means they're on their way down, right? Their creative juices are tapped. So we're seeing like all of these differences even before we even get into really much about the way the music sounds, right? We're seeing a lot of differences even just in the way these particular kinds of artists are promoted and the way the records are put together, right? Now, one thing that might lead us to believe is that much of the distinction between pop and rock is more superficial than it might appear. It might actually be based on elements that have little to do with music and more to do with presentation. Right? For example, how easy is it for a pop artist to do a decent cover of a rock song?
Pretty easy.
Happens all the time, right? And they don't change the chords or anything, right? They don't usually change the lyrics. What they change is the instrumentation and the manner of presentation. So you could use this data to argue that the distinction between pop and rock is basically a false distinction, right? And that when we look at the actual sonic elements of the actual compositional elements of the music, they're not that much different. It's really more a matter of how it's put together and presented. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only way you could make these distinctions, right? But if we're defining rock and pop in these kinds of terms, making it clear what we mean when we talk about rock and pop, that becomes a point of departure for an argument, right? So you can use definition as a basis for a claim or an argument. Because as we noted here, and as we noted in the example from The Hobbit, right, the definitions of particular words are often themselves open to dispute. So you can build a thesis around your claim for like, this is what this thing means, right? And even if you're not building your thesis around that claim, you should always make it damn clear how you are using a particular word and what you mean by it. Okay, any questions so far? Everybody with me? Okay, we're going to try doing a little something else with similar material, right? How many of you watch horror movies? Okay, that's a couple. Most of you have at least seen horror movies?
Yeah.
Okay, even if you don't particularly like them? All right, so what are the usual features of a horror movie? What's a horror movie look like? Describe one to me.
They're in dark.
Yeah.
Pardon?
A lot of them are darker.
Yeah, they're usually shot kind of dark, right? Limited lighting. right? Your vision when you're watching is usually obscured, right? Particularly at the moments that are supposed to be scary. What else? What other features do you notice in horror movies?
Most of them are about like exorcism.
Okay, a lot of them are, there is certainly a subgenre that's devoted to things like demonic possession, right? So yeah, there is often, sort of a cult or supernatural element, right? But not always.
I guess many of them deal with death.
Okay. Certainly lots of teenagers died in them, right? Lots of dead teens. What else?
Dramatic sound.
Yeah, the sound dynamics are usually they're quiet, loud dynamics, right? That kind of builds to intensity when the scary scene is happening, right? Like, I don't have any of you ever seen Jaws?
Yes.
Like when the shark is coming, right? The music is slower and quieter, the da 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 da, and then it picks up in speed and intensity as the jaws are about to open and bite, right? Yeah, horror movies do that kind of thing all the time. What else? What about characterization in horror movies? What kinds of characters do we usually see in them?
Like the jock or the kind of one.
Okay, so do we usually see characters that are very complex or three-dimensional? Yeah, most of the characters are stereotypes of various sorts, right? Very simple characterization. Good, what else? What about the order in which characters in a horror movie tend to get offed? Is the victim in a horror movie really ever the virginal straight A student? Almost never, right? The victims are usually the characters who break the rules in some way, right? So the characters who are having sex in the garage, right? Or the characters who are smoking pot out in the woods, or the characters who are, chugging antifreeze in the back of their car in the school parking lot, right? These are the people who get killed, right? So rule breakers get punished. There is actually a kind of simple conservative morality at work, usually in a horror movie, right? Now, what about the villains in horror movies? What are the villains usually like? Okay, vengeful, yeah, there's often some kind of motivation there, right? They want revenge for something, or, rarely are they completely unmotivated in their violence, right? So, yeah, there's usually, like the first Friday the 13th movie, for example, the killer isn't Jason Voorhees, hockey mask wearing, axe wielding zombie. It's actually his mother who's trying to get revenge on these teenagers at the camp for letting her son drown, right? Not watching him while he was swimming in the lake. So yeah, there is usually some sort of understandable motivation, for the villain's actions. But this will also often vary depending on the time period in which the movie was made. Because horror movies tend to reflect the specific fears of particular eras. How many of you, for example, have seen any of the Purge movies? Okay, so what's the bad guy in the Purge movies?
The government.
Okay, the government, on the one hand, right? And also, just roving gangs of marauding people, right? Who have been freed from the rules for one night, and so are murdering, stealing, raping, burning, whatever, right? Whatever they want to do, they can do. Whereas, well-off middle-class people barricade themselves in their gated communities, right? and hide in their panic rooms while these marauding groups troll through their neighborhoods, doing whatever the hell they want. So this actually reflects two separate fears, right? On the one hand, a mistrust of government, right? The idea that either government can't protect you or is actively working against your interests. Secondly, a fear of generalized others, right? People who aren't in your socioeconomic class, people who are racially different from you, right? People who, quote unquote, don't belong in your neighborhood and are just going to come in and wreck it, right? So there's a kind of two-pronged conservative morality at work, at least in the first of the few Purge movies, right? Though it looks like the most recent one seems to be taking a different direction. What about, if you look, there were actually some kind of similar themes at work in horror movies in the late 60s, right? The villains are often hippie cults that are whacked out on paganism and drugs.
Really?
That, yeah, it's actually surprisingly, it's kind of surprising how similar the Manson murders are to B-grade horror movies in the late 60s.
Okay.
So, right, basic point here is that it tends to reflect society's particular fears in a particular era, right? So, I'm going to try to apply a specific example to this category, right? One that we don't normally regard as fitting into this category. One that we normally place in another category, right? How many of you have ever seen the movie Alien? Anybody else? Okay, all right. Basically, the same people who raised their hands when they said they watch horror movies. Okay, I watched this a couple months ago on a plane coming from Dublin to Boston. Don't watch this movie on an airplane. Not smart. Not a great idea.
Nice.
Yeah. So, Alien has a lot of the superficial trappings of a science fiction movie, right? It takes place in the far future in space. Most of the action takes place on a spaceship that has landed on a distant planet, right? And the technology level is certainly beyond what would have been normal in 1977, right? It's, there are, suspension pods that the crew can sleep in for long voyages. There are complex navigational computers, and one of the characters turns out to be an extremely lifelike robot, right? So, on the surface level, this looks like a sci-fi movie. But, if we look at it in terms of our definition of horror, right? The lighting is much closer to what's typical for a horror movie than what's typical for a sci-fi. Like if you look at other sci-fi films from the 70s, like something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, that's very brightly lit, right? The old Star Trek shows are very brightly lit, right?
What's the there was another 90s movie about this ship that was interdimensional and it could travel around and it...
Are you talking about Event Horizon?
Yes.
Where it turned out
It
turned out that the ship had opened a portal to hell or something.
Right,
Yeah. Okay, yeah, we could probably make similar arguments about that movie.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So there's the lighting. We don't necessarily have the presence of the occult or the supernatural, but there is an alien being on the ship that is murdering members of the crew one by one in a sexually suggestive kind of way. It has a very kind of long tongue-like thing that it uses to penetrate people to kill them, right? Quiet, loud dynamics, lots of not dead teenagers.
Yeah.
The crew mostly looks to be sort of early middle-aged, but pretty much every one of them dies. And each of them fits a particular stereotype, right? They all have a particular role on the ship, and they seem to behave mostly according to that role. Now, pretty much everyone on the ship breaks some rule. The captain dies when he decides to go off alone, despite the others telling him not to. The first officer dies. He's the one who brings the thing in the first place because he picked up the egg when he was told not to, that it was in. The engineers have been complaining about their pay the whole time and refusing to work if they don't get a higher share of the profits from the journey, right? The navigator is unable to keep her head in stressful situations, and so always does the opposite of what she's told to do. The only person who survives, Sigourney Weaver, yeah. Her role on the ship is warrant officer. Does anybody know what a warrant officer does, like on a Navy ship? Yeah, the warrant officer is the person who enforces the rules. Make sure everybody does what they're supposed to. And she tries to do that throughout the film. The others just don't listen to her. But yeah, it's the rule-focused character who comes out alive. Now, if we look at the villain in the movie, there are actually three. The first, and most obvious, is the alien itself, which could, in the way it kills people, reflect certain fears in the late 70s about the consequences of the sexual revolution of the 60s and the early 70s, right? The second, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated, is the ship's own science officer, who turns out to be an android, who's been programmed by the company the characters work for to bring back one of these monsters at any cost, right? Even if it kills every other member of the crew. His primary directive is loyalty to the company, bring back this creature so they can study it for profit. And the third villain, which we never really see, is the company itself, which put the crew in this position in the first place. So while the alien represents certain fairly obvious sexual fears, right? Fear of casual sex in society, fine. These other two villains represent another fear that is fairly common in a lot of late 1970s culture, right? So it used to be, like, say the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? You worked your whole life for a particular company, and they provided you with a pension when you retired, and then you could have a comfortable life afterward, right? But by the late 70s, that particular system was disappearing as companies started combining with each other, right? Becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and cutting costs by frequently laying off workers, right? So one of the fears here, right, is that the company you work for isn't on your side and doesn't care about you or your interests, and that in fact some of your coworkers might be narcs who will rat you out to the company or sell you out to the company for their own advancement, right? So we've got a complex interaction here of different sets of possible cultural fears, right? The main thing I want you to get from this, though, is that what we've done here is we've taken this category that we've defined, we've applied it to an example that we wouldn't normally think would fit the category, and we can make a decent argument based on this definition that this does in fact fit that category, right? Whether you totally agree with the argument or not. Okay, so anybody have any questions about anything? Everybody follow? Everybody's still with me? All right, good. So what I want to do now is focus a little bit more on how we can use definition to draw comparisons between two objects that may seem in various ways unlike, right? So what I want you to do, I'm going to show you two music videos. And I want you to try to make a list as you're watching of the ways in which they are alike and the ways in which they are unlike, all right? And then we'll sort of compare those lists when we're done. Turn this stupid thing on. The contact you notice between these two videos.
Female counterpart character.
Yeah, the basic setup is the same, right? We have a man and a woman in a dark room with the man explaining something to the woman, right? And then going on around them are scenes from daily life in this particular place or subculture, right? So yeah, so the basic setup is the same, right? Explaining man, listening woman, good. What else is the same? Okay, yeah. Yeah, we have, like, in both videos, right, the guy singing the chorus part gets increasingly sweaty as the song goes on, right? And exceedingly so in the Weird Al video, right? So both of them have the sweaty guy. All right, good. What else? Where else do you notice points of contact?
Candles.
Okay, yep. Lots of candles, yeah. Good. What else?
It shows like stuff that they would see every day,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way it did in the original video, the stuff that they see.
Yep. What about differences? How does this depart from the Coolio video?
The woman is there to stay, but she's also an Amish person.
Okay, yeah. In the Coolio video, we had an insider explaining the culture to an outsider, right? Someone who wouldn't know how things are here. But in the Weird Al video, it's an insider explaining things to an insider, right? But it maintains the gender division that we saw in the Coolio video, right? So what two implications are there of that? The fact that it's an insider talking to an insider, that it's a man explaining to a woman.
It's somewhat sexist.
Or at least it's indicating, yeah, a sort of patriarchal value in that particular subculture, right? And does it indicate any particular desire to be understood by people outside of this subculture? I mean, at least like in the Coolio video, right, he is trying to explain to someone who doesn't live there, right, this is how things are. In the Weird Al video, that's not happening, right? So there's no real interest in the outside world. Like even the way the characters are depicted interacting with tourists, right, are by and large unfriendly, right? Tourists are, the tourists are at best a nuisance.
They don't care what the tourists think.
Yeah, they don't care at all what the tourists think. They don't feel the need to justify themselves to the tourists, right?
Like left alone by the tourists.
Yeah, there's desire to be left alone. Good.
Very isolationist.
Now, what about the settings? Like, sort of speaking along a similar theme here, right? How is the setting in the Weird Al video different from the setting in the Coolio video?
Mostly outside.
Okay, mostly outside. Although there are a lot of shots of like the schoolyard and the street in the Coolio video, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot more outdoor shots here. But what's the biggest, most noticeable difference between these two locations?
Rural instead of urban.
Yeah, this is very, very rural as opposed to an urban location, right? What about the people in the Weird Al video? How are the people in the Weird Al video different from the people in the Coolio video?
Very peaceful.
Okay, yeah, on the one hand, yeah, there are all those lines about Amish pacifism, right? Even if the Amish guy does flip a couple of people off and, you know, grab a couple of other people by the throat and threaten them, right? But there are references in the song to Amish pacifism. Well, and, you know, just on the level of racial composition, I mean, like, how are the Amish different from, say, urban gangster subcultures?
They're white ones.
Yeah, the Amish are pretty much all white, right? Most of the Amish are descended from the same group of Swiss families who came to the US in the 18th century, right? So yeah, while the characters in the Coolio video are various races, right? There are black people, there are Hispanic people, there are white people. Pretty much all of the Amish people in the Weird Al video are white. Actually, all of the Amish people in the Weird Al video are white. Okay, where else do we see a difference here? Let me ask you this then. Can we see an unexpected similarity between these two videos and the two groups depicted in them? What would be the basis for making a parody of Gangster's Paradise that focused on the Amish?
They're both seen as outsiders or treated differently.
Yeah, they're both.
Yeah.
They're both misunderstood.
Like Exodus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these are both
Pushed away.
Yeah. They're both outside of the cultural mainstream, right? Both groups are outside the cultural mainstream and are poorly understood by people who aren't part of the group, right? Hence the role of the explainer in each. So in each case, yeah, we have a group, you know, an insular subculture that is explaining itself in some sense to outsiders, right? Even though in the Weird Al video, the circle is kind of closed, right? We're just eavesdropping. Whereas the Coolio video puts us in the position of white teacher lady, right? Now, the other thing that I would suggest here, I just lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? Damn it. Oh, right, one more thing. If we think about ways in which the artists themselves are different, what relationship does each of these artists bear to the subculture he's describing? Pardon?
Well, there's someone in
Is Weird Al actually Amish?
it. That's why.
If he was, right? If he was Amish, he would not be making music videos in the first place, right? Weird Al Yankovic is a Jewish guy from Toronto. Right, so he has no direct relationship to the subculture he's describing here. I mean, you know, Coolio, on the other hand, actually came out of urban gang life in Los Angeles, right? So he has direct first-hand experience of the things that he is talking about, right? Weird Al is making a joke about a group that he doesn't belong to. So you can see how sort of by looking at similarities and differences, right, defining the parameters of what we're talking about, right, we can use pretty much anything that we see in the broader culture to build an argument, right? So this is how you would use comparison and contrast to build an argument about something. Right, so next time, right, you're going to have those enthymemes, right? We're going to talk about connecting evidence to claims. So have a good weekend. I hope this is the last thing you guys have to do today. And we'll see you on Tuesday.